Following the official Danity Kane breakup in early 2009, effectuated by Combs, Dawn experienced significant financial hardship with no prospects opportunity for employment within the entertainment field. Dawn spent several months traveling from Baltimore to Daddy's house recording studio in New York without pay or allocated budget. Mr. Combs promised that Dawn's compositions would result in payment of license fees, royalties pursuant to her contract with Bad Boy Record. However, no such compensation was ever reported or paid to Dawn. Damages relative to these continuing copyright infringements will be provided at trial. Diddy Dirty Money, Dawn's experience with Mr. Combs' gender-based physical violence, criminal acts, sexual assault, threats, and intimidation. By approximately the fall of 2009, many of Dawn's compositions had been recorded by other Bad Boy Record artists. Due to the success of her compositions, Dawn was invited to meet with musical artist Kalina Harper, Miss Harper, and shortly after Mr. Combs. Dawn and Kalina formed a new group, Diddy Dirty Money. Initial recording for Diddy Dirty Money album, Last Train to Paris, took place in Mr. Combs' home on Dufany Drive in Los Angeles, California. On the first day of recording, Dawn and Kalina arrived at Mr. Combs' home and waited in the kitchen where Mr. Combs' girlfriend, Cassie, was frying eggs for him. Dawn observed Mr. Combs come down the stairs looking high on drugs, enter the kitchen, approach Cassie and scream, "I've been asking you for my shit. I can't stand you, bitch. You never do it right." Mr. Combs pushed Cassie against the wall and choked her, then picked up the scalding hot pan of eggs, threw it at her, causing her to fall to the ground in a fetal position. Cursing and screaming, Mr. Combs dragged Cassie up the stairs. Frozen in shock and terror, Dawn heard glass shattering, crashing, and banging noises as Mr. Combs dragged Cassie up the stairs. Dawn wanted to intervene and help Cassie, but Kalina adamantly refused to interfere in Mr. Combs' relationship and physically led Dawn out of the residence. Terrified and shaken, Dawn returned to her hotel where she was unable to sleep due to worrying about Cassie and her own safety. The following day, Dawn received a call demanding that she return to Mr. Combs' residence to continue recording. Mr. Combs brought Dawn and Kalina into the recording room at the studio, locked the door, dimmed the lights, and gave each of them flowers. Mr. Combs went on at lengths, stating, "This is normal. This was just a lover's argument where no one was hurt. This is what love is. I'm giving you an opportunity. If you want to make it, you'll shut your mouth. If you say anything, there will be consequences." Mr. Combs further warned that people end up missing. Being threatened while locked in a small enclosed space with Mr. Combs after observing Mr. Combs violently assault Miss Ventura the day before, Dawn was terrified and genuinely believed that Mr. Combs would follow through on his threats. In or around November 2009, after the Soul Trade Awards in Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Combs flew Dawn and Kalina to his house in New York on his private jet for an after party. There were many well-known celebrities at the after party, and copious amounts of illegal drugs were openly consumed. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs had arranged for dozens of young women and girls, some of whom appeared to be underage, to be transported to the party. The women arrived wearing little to no clothing and were given drugs and alcohol. Many of them appeared lethargic or passed out, while Mr. Combs and his guests performed sexual acts on them. Dawn believed that her presence at the party was a test to see whether Mr. Combs could trust her. Mr. Combs repeatedly said things like, "This is a buffet. Enjoy yourselves. This is what we do. This is how we party." Dawn felt shocked and horrified at the sight of Mr. Combs and his guests violating incapacitated young girls and implored Mr. Combs' personal assistant, Capricorn Clark, to allow her to leave. Miss Clark insisted that Don wait 15 minutes for Miss Clark to make it make sense. That is, to make Don exit less copious so that Mr. Combs would not notice that she had left. Knowing that she was not free to leave and had to wait for Miss Clark to help her orchestrate her departure, Dawn experienced feelings of panic and being trapped against her will. Mr. Combs regularly placed Dawn in similar situations with no means to escape. At Mr. Combs' drug-fueled parties, his guests, including Dawn, were required to surrender the phones upon entry. Mr. Combs kept the door locked and guarded by security personnel, making it impossible for Dawn to leave without alerting Mr. Combs that she had done so. Mr. Combs hired police officers to attend the parties, sending a clear message to guests and that his influence extended to law enforcement, creating a climate of fear and a tacit warning that reporting him to authorities would be both unacceptable and futile. On many occasions, Mr. Combs had parties at his Miami, Florida residence that lasted for several days. At one of the parties, Dawn witnessed Mr. Combs openly stating that he had arranged for busloads of young, exotic girls, such as mixed Black and Asian, Indonesian, and albino. Once again, Dawn observed inebriated young girls being sexually violated by Mr. Combs and his guests. In a state of panic and terror, Dawn fled to the bedroom. Mr. Combs had insisted that she stay in and barricade the door shut with furniture. Mr. Combs openly assaulted Cassie in front of Dawn and other witnesses on multiple occasions. On one occasion, in or around fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money was in New York preparing to perform at a festival. Inside their vehicle, Mr. Combs grabbed Cassie's neck, pulled her out of the van onto the grass, and pinned her head down, choking her while yelling, "You're gonna get fucked today." This incident took place in the backstage area just outside of the festival and was entirely visible to passerbys. In another instance, in or around early 2010, Mr. Combs punched Cassie in the face in the bathroom of a Los Angeles party. Frequently, when Cassie attempted to voice an opinion or stand up to Mr. Combs, he would strike her or wrap his hands around her throat and choke her. On the first several occasions that they observed Mr. Combs assault Cassie, Dawn and Kalina spoke with Cassie to support and encourage Cassie in escaping her abusive relationship with Mr. Combs. Every time that Dawn and Kalina tried to intervene, Mr. Combs learned of the conversation and became irate. Mr. Combs screamed at the women, "Y'all bitches don't get in my relationship. Don't tell my bitch, Cassie, what she needs to be doing. Just make money and shut the fuck up. I end artists. I shelf careers. You could be missing. And you bitches want to die today?" Among other threats. In or around late 2009 or early 2010, Bad Boy Entertainment, Bad Boy entered an agreement with Interscope AM Records. Upon information and belief, Bad Boy was paid $50 million in exchange for Bad Boy's future releases being distributed through Interscope. In doing so, Mr. Combs intended to capitalize on Interscope's significant resources and enhance the promotion and sales of Bad Boy releases, including Diddy Dirty Money upcoming album. In the weeks and months leading up to the Bad Boy Interscope deal, Mr. Combs had frequent meetings with producers and then CEO of Interscope Records, Jimmy Iovine. I hope I'm saying that correctly. On one such occasion, Mr. Combs hosted a dinner at a West Hollywood, California restaurant, which Dawn and Kalina were required to attend. Among the guests at the dinner were celebrities like Neo and USHER, as well as Mr. Iovine. At the dinner, Mr. Combs and Cassie had an argument. In front of the dinner guests, Mr. Combs hissed at Cassie in a screaming whisper and forcefully punched her in the stomach, causing her to double down in invisible pain, crying. Miss Clark escorted Cassie out of the restaurant, and Mr. Combs remained and continued socializing with the dinner guests. At this point, Interscope Records clearly had actual knowledge that Combs was dangerous around females, and that Combs was willing to brazenly batter a female in public. USHER NEYO, y'all didn't speak up. You guys didn't say anything. You guys have been radio mute since Cassie's allegations. Shame on you. I'm just saying, they need to say something. They need to make a statement after this. Okay? My opinion. Even after Mr. Iovine watched Mr. Combs commit a violent assault in front of numerous high-profile witnesses, the Bad Boy Interscope deal took place and remained in effect, providing Mr. Combs with immense financial rewards, enabling him to commit further acts of violence without fear of repercussion. Watching Mr. Combs openly assault Cassie in front of Mr. Iovine and various celebrities, and observing that other powerful music industry representatives were complicit in Mr. Combs' behavior, amplified Dawn's fear that Mr. Combs could one day harm her, and that his actions would be accepted and normalized by everyone surrounding him. Definitely. Like, that's what that shows. Nobody's willing to speak up. That's what that just tells me. Y'all are willing to look away. As part of the agreement between Bad Boy and Interscope heavily promoted Diddy Dirty Money's Last Train to Paris album. Mr. Iovine had presented Mr. Combs with a demo of Coming Home for him to produce, a song that would become a multi-platinum hit. Was encouraging Mr. Combs to develop a new sound for the album, into which Interscope was investing significant resources. Dawn and Kalina and Cassie all provided vocal performances for this project. Released in November of 2010, the album The Last Train to Paris became Diddy's Dirty Money's most commercially successful project, providing vast financial rewards to both Interscope and Mr. Combs. Diddy Dirty Money, Mr. Combs subjects Dawn to labor trafficking and oppressive work conditions. In or around fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money began recording the song Love Comes Down. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs continued to use drugs and caused him to remain awake for prolonged periods of time. When he was awake, he would demand that Dawn and Kalina record in the studio, where they would spend 3 to 4 consecutive days recording without a break to eat or sleep. Mr. Combs required Kalina and Dawn to remain at his home continuously, denying the opportunity to return to their hotel rooms for breaks. The degree of control Mr. Combs exercised over Dawn's daily life and basic needs exacerbated the significant power and imbalance and threatening atmosphere that ensured Dawn's compliance with his demands. Mr. Combs regularly left the studio and required Dawn and Kalina to stay and write verses to songs. Occasionally, Dawn tried to leave to get something to eat or go to her hotel. Whenever Dawn tried to leave, Mr. Combs would call and demand, "Where the fuck are you? And we have an album to make." Mr. Combs frequently made threats, especially if they asked for food or rest, stating, "You're a bitch. I don't want to see your fucking face. I make N-words go missing, and I make things go away." Each time, Dawn returned to the studio immediately, believing that Mr. Combs was capable of following through with his threats. Mr. Combs criticized Dawn for being too skinny, yet denied her request for food and demanded that she drink only peanut butter shake. Mr. Combs had full meals prepared by a chef and ate them in front of Dawn and Kalina, never offering them food. Dawn and Kalina begged for food and rest breaks, but Mr. Combs refused, making statements such as "absolutely fucking not," and "this is not what it takes to be great." Mr. Combs' response underscored the threat he posed and heightened Dawn's concerns for her safety and well-being. As Dawn continued to work nonstop, transitioning between the studios, rehearsals, workouts, and back to the studio, she became severely dehydrated, experienced chronic stomach cramping from being undernourished and excessively thin. On the numerous occasions that she told Mr. Combs that she is not feeling well, he called her lazy and dismissed her health concerns, instilling her further apprehension of communicating her needs. In or around summer of 2010, Dawn experienced abdominal pain, swollen glands, and a fever. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with arthralgia, which is joint pain due to overuse, sprain, and infections, anemia. So she was diagnosed with arthralgia, anemia, and a low white blood cell count. Dawn presented Mr. Combs with their medical records specifying that she needed to emphasize eating well, being adequately hydrated, and getting adequate rest. But Mr. Combs ordered her to report to the studio the next day for another multi-day recording sessions. Mr. Combs' blatant disregard for her health and well-being cemented Dawn's fear of his authority and control over her health and career. Dawn continued to witness Mr. Combs' abuse towards Cassie. Cassie often wore glasses, sunglasses, makeup in an attempt to hide the visible injuries. These incidents further solidified Dawn's fear of Mr. Combs, as they were constant reminders of the physical dangers she potentially could and eventually would face. Mr. Combs often exhibited uncontrollable anger during the recording sessions, throwing objects like albums, laptops, food against the wall or individuals. Mr. Combs frequently flew into a frenzy of unpredictable rages. Dawn feared making any missteps that could direct his anger towards her. However, her fears went beyond her immediate physical safety because she had witnessed Mr. Combs' violent nature, a side of Mr. Combs that the world had not yet seen. She feared that falling out of Mr. Combs' good graces, or worse, standing up to him or speaking out against him, could result in serious harm to her. Dawn frequently thought about Mr. Combs' threats about making people go missing and fear taking any action that could label her a target. Despite Mr. Combs' violent threats and misogyny, Diddy Dirty Money experienced significant sales, selling 2 million copies of one single, 500,000 of another in the US, and in Australia, 500,000 single copies. Dawn's unpaid wages and royalties are estimated to be 1,200,000. Dawn's unpaid touring wages are estimated to be 350,000 for touring dates within the USA alone. Ciroc and Diddy Beats non-payment. In or around summer of 2009, Dawn and Kalina were required by Mr. Combs to perform as Diddy Dirty Money and attend numerous promotion events, including late or overnight parties, all of which were under contract between Diddy and Ciroc Vodka, or between Combs and Diddy Beats, pursuant to the Bad Boy Interscope deal. Dawn was never compensated for the extra time she spent fulfilling Mr. Combs' promotional contracts, including the Ciroc and Diddy Beats campaign. Mr. Combs was paid approximately $250 per Ciroc appearance. Mr. Combs did not compensate Dawn or Kalina for these appearances, other than just $5,000 each on a handful of occasions. Mr. Combs' ongoing explanations of withholding compensation was that their appearance were a requirement of their tour. Additionally, Dawn was required to appear and to promote Diddy Beats through parties, albums, and songs and videos. So I do kind of wonder, how much did they make for all of this? Like, what were they compensated? I don't know if there's, clearly a forensic accountant is going to have to go through that and find out what did they actually make, because they were basically ripped off based on what this lawsuit reads. Over the time, Mr. Combs was paid $6.25 million for 25 Ciroc shows that Dawn was required to attend. Following each show, Dawn and Kalina approached Mr. Combs to inquire about their insufficient sporadic payments. Mr. Combs routinely responded with statements such as, "You bitches ain't grateful, and you ain't want this." Dawn estimated lawsuits for Ciroc campaign promotions totaling over $1,562,000, totaling at least over $1 million. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs received an advance on Diddy Beats, for which Dawn received no compensation. Mr. Combs sexually harassed and assaulted Dawn. Between approximately 2009 2011, throughout Diddy Dirty Money recording processes, rehearsals, and performances, where Mr. Combs repeatedly ordered Dawn to strip down to her underwear. He frequently referred to her as a bitch or a whore and made demeaning remarks about her body, alternatively calling her lazy, fat, ugly, skinny, particularly in front of the friends and producers and bodyguards. Mr. Combs frequently held meetings with Dawn wearing only his underwear, despite Dawn protests and repeated requests for him to put on clothes. In response, Mr. Combs calling her a bitch or a whore and reminding her that she should be grateful for the opportunity to be there. Often, while they were recording in the studio, Mr. Combs would hold parties where he would invite young men and women who were often scantily dressed and appeared underage to use drugs and engage in sex acts. Dawn observed Mr. Combs and his colleagues kissing, groping, inappropriately touching the young women. Upon information and belief, the participants often left the immediate area to have sex and returned shortly thereafter. On numerous occasions between approximately 2009 2011, under the guise of preparing for performances, Mr. Combs would intrude into Dawn's changing room at Daddy's house unannounced while Dawn was undressed. Even though a female stylist was present and assisting Dawn in her wardrobe, Mr. Combs would grope Dawn's body, including her bare butt and her chest area near her breasts, with no legitimate purposes and without Dawn's consent. Mr. Combs caressed her buttocks to show the stylist where he wanted her high-waisted panties position, and attempted to touch her breasts, claiming to show the stylist where he wanted her bra strap to go. When Mr. Combs would enter the changing room, Dawn would cover her chest and her hands to prevent Mr. Combs from seeing or touching her breasts. When Mr. Combs would touch her, Dawn would attempt to swat his hand away and state, "Don't touch me." Mr. Combs frequently smacked Dawn's bare butt and often commented on her, noting that although she was too skinny, she had an ass. Ignoring her visible and communicated discomfort, Mr. Combs persisted and continued to intrude when Dawn was in the dressing room, continued to touch her buttocks and breast area under the guise of showing the stylist what to do, and continuing to smack her buttocks without consent. In or around October 2010, Diddy Dirty Money performed in Glasgow in Scotland, where Mr. Combs engaged in overt sexual advances towards Dawn on numerous occasions. When Dawn exited the dressing room fully styled, Mr. Combs looked at her approvingly and smacked her buttocks while making comments such as, "You're looking good. Okay, Dawn, okay." And I see what that is, in a flirtatious tone. Each time, Dawn moved away and asked him not to touch her, but Mr. Combs disregarded her protests. On their last night in Scotland, Dawn witnessed Mr. Combs and several other males gangbanging Mr. Combs' female assistant at the hotel pool. Dawn immediately left and went to her hotel room. On their flight back to the United States the next day, Dawn asked Mr. Combs where his assistant was. Mr. Combs replied, I don't give a fuck where that bitch is." Dawn later learned that Mr. Combs had taken his assistant's passport with him to the United States, leaving the assistant stranded in the United Kingdom. In Scotland, Kalina confided in Dawn about her husband and manager Tony Vick. Mr. Vick was abusive. After an especially severe assault, she confided in Dawn that she wanted to leave Mr. Vick, and Dawn helped her plan her exit from the relationship. However, Kalina and Mr. Vick reconciled, and both Mr. Combs and Vick, who had a close relationship, learned of Dawn's role in helping Kalina. Both Mr. Combs and Vick became noticeably distrustful of Dawn, which exacerbated her fears of harm and reprisal. When Mr. Combs would require his Diddy Dirty Money bandmates to stay at his residence in Miami, Dawn would barricade herself inside the room every night, placing heavy furniture against the door because she feared being harmed in her sleep. In or around late December 2010, Dawn Kalina and Cassie were in Mr. Combs' Los Angeles home when Mr. Combs stated, "I want to give you fake titties for Christmas." Mr. Combs reached out and cupped Dawn's breast without her permission and stated, "You're an A, I'm thinking a D." Dawn recoiled in shock and left the room. Throughout the above-mentioned time period, when Dawn resisted Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs retaliated by denying her singing parts in songs, removing her from songs, refusing to allow her to sing in performances, and turning her microphone off during performances. The more Dawn rebuffed his advances, the more Mr. Combs' retaliatory behavior increased. Mr. Combs' assault and false imprisonment of Dawn. In or around December 2010, Diddy Dirty Money was preparing for an upcoming performance on Saturday Night Live, SNL. As usual, rehearsals lasted for days without opportunity to eat or rest, and rehearsal schedule was unpredictable. After waiting all day for Mr. Combs to call or send a car, Dawn received a phone call from Mr. Combs demanding, "Where the fuck are you bitches? You bitches don't want this. Y'all don't deserve to have someone pick up, get a cab." Dawn and Kalina immediately took a taxi to SUR Studios, anxious because Mr. Combs sounded enraged. Upon arrival to SUR Studios, Mr. Combs and Harv Pierre were waiting for them on the lobby. Mr. Combs screamed obscenities at them. "Where the fuck you bitches? You bitches don't win. You bitches don't want to win. You don't want this. I'm tired of y'all." Dawn noticed that people in the lobby were reacting to Mr. Combs. Embarrassed, Dawn asked Mr. Combs to stop swearing and calling them bitches in front of everybody. Mr. Combs' facial expressions shifted as he stepped towards Dawn, raised his arm and swung his fist towards her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit him, Dawn braced for impact. Before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs' bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio, and forced her into the Bad Boy Records Bentley that was parked outside. Miss Kalina ran after Dawn, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley door with both women inside. Inside the vehicle, Dawn realized that there's no interior door handles and that they were locked inside, no way to escape. Dawn's belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Kalina's cell phone. Dawn relayed to her father what happened and that she needed help and feared that she would go missing. Moments later, Mr. Combs' bodyguard removed only Kalina from the Bentley, leaving Dawn locked in the car alone for 2 hours. Dawn screamed as loud as she could, but no one would respond. It was late evening in the winter time. The windows were heavily tinted, and the interior of the car was dark, except for a faint interior light. Dawn's belongings and winter coats were in the studio while the ignition was off. There was no heat. With Mr. Combs' prior threats and violence running through her mind, Dawn felt sheer panic, terror, and feeling of claustrophobia at being locked in a small and dark enclosed space with no way to communicate or call the police. She begged. She began to feel cold and feared for her life, not knowing when or if she would be released. Dawn's father drove to New York from Baltimore, arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Dawn from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Dawn's father between several rooms at SUR Studios, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Dawn's father expressed that he intended to contact the police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs' threats and actions, which in turn made Dawn feel terrified for her and her family's safety. The next night, Diddy Dirty Money performed on SNL. Mr. Combs subsequently called Dawn, complimented her performance, and concluded with the threat, "You don't call your dad unless you're in the hospital." Unjust enrichment of defendant by breach of contract and or copyright infringement. As a member of Danity Kane, Dawn has performed over 15 songs and holds composition credit for more than 3 songs. Defendants have failed to account or pay Dawn as agreed for her composition and her performance, and have breached contracts and infringed her copyrights, all which has unjustly enriched defendants. As a member of Diddy Dirty Money, Dawn has performances recorded on over 9 songs. Additionally, Dawn has composition rights and credits on more than 5 songs. Defendants have failed to account or pay Dawn as agreed in her composition. And they list the songs and her performance, breach contracts, and or infringe her copyright, unjustly enriching defendants. In 2020, Mr. Combs selected Dawn for a reboot of Making the Band, and Dawn spent hours preparing to be a judge on the new show. However, the COVID-19 pandemic halted those plans, and Dawn was never compensated in any way. On or about July 1st, 2021, Mr. Combs and Bad Boy Records Holding directed Janice Combs Publishing to assign the administration rights of Dawn's song, held from her tenure with defendants in the years 2005 and 2012, to Sony Songs, a division of Sony Music Publishing, LLC Sony. The assignment, assigned by Dawn on October 22nd, 2024, purported to credit through a semi-annual accounting Dawn's royalty account for Dawn's compositions from between 80 to 90% of publisher's share. However, no statements were ever provided, no payments were ever made, and no revisions nor assignments were ever recorded with performing rights organization or other royalties collecting entities by defendant or by Sony. Defendant have wholly failed to account to or pay Dawn as agreed for her compositions and her performance, in breach of the assignment, and have thereby infringed her copyrights, resulting in defendants being unjustly enriched. During the summer of 2023, Mr. Combs' new recording company, Love Records Inc., tendered a contract for negotiations to Dawn for the new song entitled Deliver Me, embodied as track 3 on the Love album, Off the Grid, officially released September 15, 2023. Upon information and belief, Deliver Me sold well prior to Mr. Combs' legal troubles in November of 2023. Continuing to present, Dawn sought to establish her rightful percentage as 21% composer on Deliver Me. Mr. Combs personally called Dawn and left a voicemail complaining about her fair requests. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs directed his attorneys to avoid confirming the composition percentages on the song, and in fact, list composers who played no part in composing the song. As a result, the contract was never signed by either Dawn or Love Records Inc. Nevertheless, Dawn obtained a copyright registration certificate on a timely basis. Said registration listed authors as agreed when the song was created in 2009. That registration is filed separately in the court and supports Dawn's claim of copyright infringement by defendants herein. Defendant Love Records Inc. and Mr. Combs infringe Dawn's copyright in the composition of Deliver Me by releasing Deliver Me without Dawn's permission and without compensation. As a result of the acts and conduct complained of herein, Dawn has suffered and will continue to suffer the loss of income, wages, benefits, royalty, promotional fees, touring fees, and other compensation. Dawn has also suffered, among other things, future pecuniary losses, emotional pain, suffering, inconvenience, loss of employment, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, insomnia, panic attacks, and other non-pecuniary losses, entitling her to an award of compensatory and punitive damages, injunctive and declarative reliefs, attorney fees and costs, and other remedies as this court may deem appropriate. There's been a lot of money, income numbers that have been thrown, but so far what we know is that she is at the very least asking for $3.3 million of unpaid wages and salaries and royalties, and $1.55 million in unpaid compensation from Diddy, because she's going for the record label. She's going for a lot of different things. Now, it should be noted that Lisa Bloom is her lawyer. Pay attention to how that lawsuit was written, because that lawsuit, it ain't include no pictures. Okay. It was a very well written lawsuit. You could tell that it's somebody who, has some experience helping victims, but that's just my opinion, y'all. That's just my opinion. Y'all let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you guys think? What is Diddy gonna do? What is Diddy gonna do? I'll see you guys on the next one. Rabbits out. Thank you for watching. Bye, guys.